So what we're going to look at is an introduction to MROCs, Market Research Online Communities, and community panels, and more generically at what are called research communities. We've had mention of the GRIT report already today, and according to the last GRIT study, research communities are the fastest growing major research technology, in the way that CATI once was the fastest growing and online was the fastest growing. So much bigger, much faster moving than, say, neuroscience, facial coding, and these sort of techniques. SMR currently estimate that it's 3%, and we expect it to grow more than that. And I'm going to come back to some numbers around that in a little while. What do we mean by research communities? Well, they tend to have these four characteristics: private, branded, research communities. And I'm going to unpack those in terms of a specific community. This is the Banana Republic community. It's based in the United States predominantly. It's got over 50,000 members of that community. And so let's unpack what we mean. Private. Well, as you can see here, people have to log into the site. You can't use Google or Bing or Yahoo to find out what's going on in that community. You have to have an account, you have to agree to terms and conditions. That doesn't mean that it's safe. Nothing on the internet is safe. That's not how the internet works. But what it does mean is that you can have a level of protection. You know who you're talking to. The incentive scheme will often help identify who people are as well. If people want to receive their incentives, then actually they have to reveal who they are when they sign up properly in the process. So we have something that is private. It's not open to general viewing. Almost all MROCs, community panels, research communities are branded. Why would you want to help Banana Republic? Well, it's likely to be because you're a shopper or an ex-shopper, you have some emotional relationship with them, and you feel that you want them to do better. That might mean you're a fan, might mean you really don't like them very much, but it does mean that you want to improve them. It's important that it's branded because we want people in the community to know they're being listened to, and we want to be able to show them that results have happened as a consequence. It's not always possible to do a branded community, but I would estimate, looking across a wide range of vendors, that well over 90% of them are branded. It's a research community. Now, Banana Republic is quite a big community at 50,000, but if it had 5 million, it would be a marketing community, and research would find it very hard to get a share of the action on that sort of community. So actually the fact that it is tens or hundreds or thousands of people, as opposed to hundreds of thousands or millions, helps protect it as a resource for research. Because it's only used for research, the relationship with the members of that community is different. They know they're not going to be sold. They know that if they say that something looks really quite interesting, they're not going to get a direct mail for that the next day saying, would you like to buy it? So that gives us a lot of protection there. And the final point is that it's a community. So imagine we're talking about two banks. We might be talking about ING and HSBC. If I bank with HSBC, I have some degree of interest in improving the services that bank offers. I would like to have better rates, better information, more contact, all sorts of things. So I might join an HSBC community to help them improve the services I get. There's no point in me joining an ING community if I'm not a customer of theirs, because I have no community of interest with them. So there always needs to be a community of interest. And when we look at the ones that are not branded, they tend to be things like people are interested in a particular sport, people who are interested in a particular activity like cooking, like music. There needs to be something that causes a community of interest to happen. And you know when you've got a community because you don't have to bribe people to take part in the research. That's really one of the key tests about whether you have a panel, a list, or a community. Do you have to bribe people to take part in the research, or are they happy to be involved in the research? Now, there are two key dimensions in the world of research communities. The first is size. There are communities out there with as few as 30 people in them, and there are communities with over 50,000 people in them. The second dimension is, are they short-term or long-term? There are communities that last only 3 or 4 days, and I should say that not everybody accepts that those are communities. I know that Diane Heston of CommuniSpace has gone on record as saying it takes time to create a community. But there are plenty of other people out there who really do believe in these short-term communities. And then there are communities that last for years. And certainly I've worked on some that are now in their 6th or 7th year, and a few of the people in the community have been members of the community for all that time. So given this framework, we can see that the left-hand side is about qualitative research. It's about qualitative research because the numbers are small. In terms of a small number of people for a long period of time, you have a lot of sensitizing going on as well. The top right quadrant is where you can do quantitative research, but of course there's nothing stopping you taking 30 people from your 50,000 and running an MROC or running a forum or running a discussion. There's nothing to stop you taking 6 or 7 people and running an online focus group. So if you've got a large number of people, you can run quant and you can run qual. Now, to put some typical names, although I think, as you're going to see in a moment, that some of these names are going to change and disappear, typically we would call the long-term qualitative community and the short-term qualitative community MROCs. This term was coined a few years ago by Forrester Research. It stands for Market Research Online Community, and there is no particular reason in the wording of the name why they should be qualitative. It's simply one of the assumptions that a lot of people make when they're trying to describe the product. It also, to some extent, describes the software choices. People using smaller communities typically use platforms that are very engaging, that are very qualitative, that have lots of ability to have characters and these sorts of things, whereas the large long-term communities are typically called community panels, and they tended to start with software that was very good for managing large numbers, and they added a more qualitative element to it. So we had a platform that was largely about qualitative on the left, we had a platform that was initially largely about quantitative on the right, but both of these types of platforms are moving on, not surprisingly. And recently we've seen a growth of short-term quantitative and qualitative large communities, particularly where clients have a database, and these can be configured very quickly. And I'm going to show you a case study in a few moments. I think the naming of these communities is going to change quite radically, and I think we should avoid getting too hung up on any particular set of naming, because the names we have at the moment, the MROCs and the community panels, really are platform names. They date back to the sort of software that was being used to create them. However, that software is changing. There is increasingly no reason why you shouldn't run a qualitative community on a platform that was originally designed to be quantitative, because it's so much better. And there are growing levels of panel health and panel management being built into some of the more qualitative panels, which means they will be able to generate the larger communities. So these platform-related names of MROC and community panel will probably become less salient, because clients tend to want to think about them as insight communities or engagement communities. They want to think in terms of their objectives in communicating with their customers, their followers, their users. A name related to the platform really is neither here nor there. The technicians are going to want to know it, but it's really not so relevant to clients. And then, of course, we have the views that members of the research communities might give it, and it's my voice, my views, my opportunity, my Starbucks idea, all of these sort of personal words. And I must admit, when I see these communities being named, I'm much happier with my voice than your voice, for example, because I think it puts the orientation the right way round and gives the right sort of semiotic message. So I think we're going to see these 3 types of naming in the future. There will be the tech side will talk about the platform, the clients will talk about what they're aiming to achieve, and we need to talk to potential members about how it is that they will see these communities. So here's the first of the examples. This is the Discovery, a TV channel. as you're aware. This particular community is based in the UK. It was launched in 2007. My colleagues took it over in April 2012. It's got about 3,000 core members. And here's one of the most important things about these larger ongoing communities. Response rates of 50 to 55%. If you want to do qualitative and quantitative, then you need a high response rate. If you're doing qualitative, it doesn't really matter. If it's a short-term community, it doesn't really matter what the response rate is. But with a long-term community, if you want to do quantitative research as well, you need a high response rate because you need to manage who is answering which survey. How do you balance new members with members who have been in the community for longer? How do you ensure that you get a consistent read? Of course, every community is going to have a degree of bias and sensitizing, but what we know in quantitative research is you try to hold the bias constant. If you can hold the bias constant and recognize it, for example, by running non-community studies, then you can start to do some really interesting quantitative research. Now, Discovery is a media channel, so they understand that it's about entertaining their members. So they use a lot of visual type questions where they're dragging faces of presenters around, which they call talent, where they're using slider scales, where they're using drag and drop. They know that they've got to do things. So the bottom left scale like that, they can drop on and they can use different characteristics on these pictures. They also understand, and this is true of the MROCs, the qualitative communities, the quantitative communities, if you want to engage people, you have to feed back to them. So here are some work that Discovery has done in sending back newsletters, in finding out what people are doing when they're not watching Discovery. During the recent Olympics in the UK, many Discovery viewers watched the Olympics instead, but Discovery wanted to stay in touch with those people. They said, we are still interested in you. You still exist even when you're not watching our channel. And one of the most fundamental elements of engagement, more important than attractive surveys, more important than gamification, is feedback. People have to know that A, they've been listened to, and B, that some of their ideas have been implemented. Here are the sort of things that Discovery are using it for. They're using it to test their programs, particularly at the start of series, to see if it's going correctly. Who should they be hiring as talent and presenters? The people who do advertising with them can get some research. They're going to look at testing their print ads. They're going to do a tracker of involvement and engagement, more along the lines of mystery shopping than the classic ad hoc tracker that will be done through a third-party service. So all sorts of things, and of course just simple ad hoc research. Now here's a second example, and in many ways as different as you can imagine. From the UK again. It's the Institute of Directors, created in 1903. To be a member of this, you have to be the managing director or a listed director of a listed company, and there are 36,000 members of this organization, so it's not an enormous organization, but these are very difficult to interview people. They are managing directors, CEOs, CFOs. They're very busy, they're very expensive. 85% male, 90% between 40 to 69. Frankly, they're quite often grumpy. But 3,000 of those 36,000 members are part of their research community, Policy Voice. So how do they get these incredibly difficult people to take part in the community in a way that's beneficial? Well, the most important way is they prove that taking part in the community results in action. So when they do a study, it's frequently released to the media. The Financial Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, the Daily Mail will report what business leaders say. So they turn the research views into a lobbying voice. Earlier this year, when the budget was being proposed by the government, there was a new tax in there. The Institute directors talked to their 3,000 members. They came back and they explained to the government why it was a bad idea. That was probably one of the factors that resulted in the tax not being put forward. We do know that they were listened to. We do know that their cases were heard. The government, of course, denied that they specifically changed it on the basis of this feedback, but it certainly was taken as a major endorsement by the members of the community. So we can start to see some mechanics of what is happening. One of the most important things for the Institute of Directors is that all surveys have at least 1,000 completes. That is a sort of an external face validity. When they go to talk to the media, when they go to talk to David Cameron, the Prime Minister, they want to be able to show that they have a substantial body. They can do that because they get a completion rate of 45% and better. So even though there are only 3,000 people in the community, they can achieve this 1,000. One of the ways they do that is by recognizing who they're talking to, these senior business people. They give them long enough to do the survey. They typically will have a week, maybe more sometimes, to do the survey. Members of the community know they will only ever get one survey a month. That's what they've signed up to. You can't change the rules on these people. I was recently talking to somebody who's running another community. They've done 154 projects in 9 months. Some people are doing several projects a week. But that is what was set up as the norm for that community. And some of those projects are a lot of fun. They're things like download this app and play with it for a few days and tell us what you think. But in this community, we're talking to these senior business people, one survey a month. The surveys still can't be boring. These are serious business people, but they expect a proper survey written in an engaging way using the modern tools. And one of the important things, and very time-consuming, coming back to Sue Bell's presentation earlier, is that every single comment, there's 1,000 responses coming in, that might generate 2,000 verbatims. Every one of those is read by the staff of the Institute of Directors, and they will often send hundreds of emails back to these senior business people to say, thank you for your point, the answer to your question is this, we've looked for the answer to your question, we will be passing this recommendation on to the Director General, etc. So you have to budget for quite a bit of user time at the client in order to be able to work with a community well. The third and final example is a very different sort of community. This is a short-term community. It's for Cathay Pacific, operating in Hong Kong, looking at Cantonese and English. And this was very challenging. This was done by one of the newer agencies up in Hong Kong, ABN Impact. And the challenge they got was, can you do the community in about 4 weeks? So in week 1, they had to build the community. They had to recruit 600 members from the client's database. In weeks 2 to 4, they did a profiling questionnaire to find out what sort of customers that they got, how do they go against the user types. Then they did 6 surveys within those 3 weeks of research. They did numerous online discussions, lots and lots of rapid feedback to multiple teams. The client was going through a major strategic review. It had got management consultants there. It had got lots and lots of people working in teams. The researchers were able to support all of those different teams, sending back answers really rapidly. So at the end of the project, ABNI Impact researched, why did people take part? And here are a couple of the very typical comments that people made. As a loyal supporter of Cathay Pacific for over 25 years, I felt I had opinions that might ensure that the Cathay Pacific brand retained its high quality. And another one, I was interested to know what improvements Cathay plan and also to be involved with those in some small way. So you can see that where the community element is coming in here. Even though this was a short-term community, it was pre-existing. These people already identified with Cathay Pacific. They tended to fly quite often with Cathay Pacific. They felt they had an emotional stake. It was their airline to some extent, and they wanted to help it get better. What do they think about being involved in the research process, particularly as it was very intensive? As we said, there was the profiling survey, 6 other surveys, online discussions, all happening within a 3 to 4 week period. A very well executed experience. I like the easy ways the questions were set up and convenient for me to respond. An excellent way to provide feedback on Cathay Pacific product and services. Far better than those in-flight questionnaires. Being part of the panel makes you feel closer to Cathay Pacific. So there is a real hunger out there to move away from the very static way that classic research has been done for airlines to make it more interactive. These people have really rejected the paper route and they're looking for something new. What was interesting, coming back to Lachlan's presentation a moment ago, was how people took part in the surveys and the various elements. And what we saw in Hong Kong amongst people who can afford to fly fairly regularly on Cathay Pacific is that 8% of all the survey responses we got, there were about 3,000 responses in total across the projects and the respondents, were done from smartphones and mobile phones. 12% were done from tablets, and to me, I think it's really interesting that that is bigger. And as you walk down most planes these days, if you're walking back to the galley or the bathrooms or something, you will see just how many people are using their tablets. So you can see why, when they're commuting, when they're on the trains, when they're back in the airports, when they're in their office, when they're at home at the weekend, the tablet is such an interesting option. And when we think mobile, we shouldn't just think smartphone, we also need to think tablet. But of course, 80% still completed their surveys on the PC. We need to see that at the moment as the major feature driving the process through. Also, when we look at these results, a lot of the research was about mobile options and facilities that Cathay Pacific could provide. We need to segment the data by the data collection method to see if there are any effects in interpreting that. So if you are thinking of doing some research communities, there are some issues to consider. Do you want to do a short-term or a long-term project? Typically, you'll do a short-term project if you have a very specific research need. You might do it instead of doing those concept tests. You might do it instead of doing those 6 focus groups. Long-term is where you enter into a commitment with your customers that you're going to be listening more than talking, and that you are going to be acting on what you listen. Are you going to do a community that's qual only, or are you going to do quant and qual? There are some really interesting things being done with the qual communities, particularly in ideation, where the community is used specifically to create new ideas, to generate ideas. Other people, however, and probably the majority, are going down the route of saying, no, I want to do quant and qual. This is a bit of a mouthful, but what it's saying is, do you want to run that community yourself? Do you want to, as a client, script surveys? Do you want to run online discussions? And in some markets and in some countries, we're seeing this is a very popular option. This is kind of a vendor name, I guess, self-serve. A more typical name might be DIY, do it yourself. At the other end of the spectrum, we have full service, where everything is provided by a research agency. The research agency will manage the community, will script the surveys, will do the analysis of the surveys, will run the discussions, will do the analysis of the discussions. And then between the two is the space where a growing number of clients live, which is assisted. They say that we will run some of the instant surveys, the polls, the fun polls. We will run some of the discussions. We will certainly do some of the analysis ourselves. But when we have more complex surveys, when we have a heavier workload, then we'd like to draw on an agency to provide that. And that could be one agency, or it could be multiple agencies. Is your community going to be branded or blind? And my recommendation is, if it can be branded, it should be. The cases where it can't are really where the brand isn't strong enough, very much where it's a second player. So if you're selling an alcohol beverage that's an occasional drink, then you might want to have a liqueurs community. If you're selling a cooking ingredient, then you might want a cooking community as opposed to fans of your particular stock or sauce. But generally speaking, if the branded option will work, then that's the way to go. Short-term qualitative. As I say, it tends to be a replacement for the research. So instead of doing diaries, instead of doing surveys, instead of doing groups, it's often very high intensity. Quite often, significant incentives are being paid with short-term qual. You might look to include gamification. There's a presentation on that in the next training session in a few hours. Certainly co-creation, autoethnography, where people are capturing slices of their own life and telling the story. You might bring them into a central location to have face-to-face elements in the research. Very often used for website designing, concept development, story creation. What about long-term qual? It tends to be a commitment to long-term listening and co-creating. So you're saying something significant to your customer base. It's seen as the people who are in the community are seen as the representatives of the customers as advisors. I've sometimes seen these called customer juries or citizen juries, where members of the laity, the ordinary customers, are promoted up to act as advocates and articulators of the views of the majority. What sort of things do people do? Co-creating designs, looking at creating materials and literature, used as a sort of mystery shopping, where they're set every time they will perhaps go on a journey, they will take videos and pictures and write down thoughts about that journey. Mass ethnography and autoethnography, exploring their own lives and the lives of people around them. Concept screening, because one of the things that these communities are very good at is if they think an idea is rubbish, it usually is rubbish. If they like it, you still may want to test it quantitatively, but they can be really good as first up screeners and suggestions for improvements as well. Long-term qual and quant community. The main reason why clients go for these, frankly, is that there are very significant cost benefits over other approaches. Yes, they do it because they want to start understanding their clients better, they want to have a discourse, they want to be seen to be listening, and they want to listen. But the fact that they can save quite a lot of money, or they can do a lot more research for the same money, is probably the main driver. The main thing that creates these as a viable alternative is panel management. The thing that differentiates the qualitative platforms from the quantitative platforms is that you have a set of procedures and software and tools that allows you to know who did what survey, what incentive are they entitled to, what is their response rate over time, what are their known characteristics, and so on, and a set of procedures to use those tools properly. And it's really the combination of the tools and the procedures that make the long-term large community viable. Usage examples, well, you might use that long-term community for qual, and you would use it for everything except where non-users or market sizing or fresh sample is required. So you wouldn't use it to record spontaneous awareness. So every month you might ask a question, are you aware of me? Are you aware of me now? Now are you aware of me? It doesn't work. So there are types of questions where you need non-users. There are types of, for example, market sizing. There are sometimes where you want to get an independent rating on what you're doing. But for the vast majority of quantitative and qualitative research, you can use these large communities. What about incentives? Short-term qualitative incentive, it tends to be an extrinsic reward. So it might be money, it might be air miles, it might be products, but it's something that can be exchanged and which is clearly seen as a transferable benefit. Long-term qual, they tend to be a mixture of intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic is making people feel good about themselves, showing that they've been listened to, giving them the chance to implement their ideas, bringing them in to visit the brand, sending products, not as incentives, but simply as a thank you. All of those can be intrinsic values. If you want people to stay on a community for years, then you need to have intrinsic. You can't actually bribe most people with extrinsic rewards to be really active in a long-term qualitative community. Exactly the same is true of the long-term qual and quant community, the things we currently call community panels. You cannot afford to bribe people to take part in these. You need to have your extrinsic reward simply as a thank you. The motivation needs to be intrinsic. They need to know that they are the special advisors, they're specially being listened to. Think about those really senior executives in the Institute of Directors community. They know that what they say in that community probably has more impact on government policy than what they do when they cast their vote in the election. That's a really powerful intrinsic reward. So with long-term qual and quant communities, panel management, including being able to provide intrinsic rewards and managing complex extrinsic rewards, is key. That is what delivers a reliable and robust outcome in those cases. So thank you very much.